Technology at its best. Hello, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening, everyone, all around the world today. I'm Kathleen Trigg-Jones. Thank you so much for joining us for this Mojo Streaming live stream interview today on the topic of blood lions, something that we've been following very closely here at Mojo Streaming, and we'll continue to follow until we have a solution that we think is the best solution. Based on what we believe should be a human rights and a wildlife rights issue on everyone's mind globally. So I'm Kathleen Trigg-Jones. I'm here in New York City, and I'm joined today by Dr. Louise de Waal of Blood Lions, and I will introduce her in a little while. But again, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and we're going to talk today about blood lions. As you may know, the South African government has made a critical decision to ban captive lion facilities in South Africa and to halt the commercial use of captive lions and their derivatives, according to a report that came out last month. This is a really big issue. It's a breaking news issue that you might know has not been getting mainstream attention. And that's because this is a very divided topic. Some people fall on either side of the fence, and that's what we want to talk about today. It's something we care very deeply about at Mojo Streaming, and that's why we've dedicated several conversations now to this topic. I am joined today very happily by Dr. Louise de Waal, who's the campaign manager and director of Blood Lions. She has an academic and research background in environmental management. For many years, she has been involved in investigating and exposing the exploitative industries associated with the commercial captive breeding and keeping of blood lions and other cats in South Africa. Before we dive into the conversation with Dr. de Waal, I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Peter Catt is joining us today, and we had a wonderful conversation not long ago with Dr. Catt, who is also very passionate about this issue. And I also just want to acknowledge our founder, not Dr. Bernard, Bernard, who I think is hanging out here someplace, but he's the founder of Mojo Streaming and just quite a genius and just an amazing human being. And I'm really proud to be partnered with him in this endeavor. And the rest of you, our board members and everyone else that's joining us today, thank you. So I do want to jump right in, though, to interview Dr. de Waal. I also want to make it known that this is being recorded. So if you have any issues with that, then please feel free to hide your camera. At the end of our interview, we will open it up to questions. I beg everyone to please be respectful of Dr. de Waal and your questions. And we all have a different opinion, and that's fine. And we honor the different opinions, but we just want to make sure that we're also very respectful in all of our questions and in the discussion. Lively, passionate, but respectful. That's all we ask. So Dr. de Waal recently published 2 joint peer-reviewed papers, one on the zoonosis of African lions and another on ending commercial lion farming in South Africa, a gap analysis approach. A further joint peer-reviewed paper is pending publication, namely welfare challenges relating to commercial captive lion breeding in South Africa. She was instrumental in the establishment of the Coalition to Stop the Captive Breeding and Keeping of Lions and Other Big Cats for Commercial Purposes. She is the coordinator and sits on the steering committee lobbying and governmental and other stakeholders involved in this space. She worked for many years as a sustainable tourism consultant dealing with unethical tourism offerings involving captive wildlife, and the reputational damage of the commercial captive predator breeding industry that it inflicts on South Africa's tourism brand. So again, Dr. de Waal, thank you so much for joining us. She holds a PhD in environmental management. She is a wealth of information, and we are so honored to have you joining us today. I think we should just start with, we're wildlife enthusiasts. Some of us, are maybe even hunters that are on this call. Some of us are very passionate about our pets and this topic. But let's just start out talking in layman's terms about what blood lions means. What does that term really mean?
The term is obviously a term that has been invented for the breeding of lions in captivity for commercial purposes. And those commercial purposes starts very early on when lions are taken, or cubs, I should say, are taken from their mothers at very young age, sometimes hours to days after birth. They are being taken away from their mothers, often involving paying volunteers and hand-reared. Now, the hand-rearing actually habituates these animals to people, and it's easier to handle them and to obviously make money in the early stages of their lives. So a lot of these cubs go into petting facilities where tourists come in and they pay for the privilege to pet a very cute little lion cub, but a cub obviously that's supposed to be with its mum and its siblings. And they involve paying volunteers to look after these animals. Very often they are being brought in under false pretenses that these cubs are orphaned or abandoned by their mothers, and that they will be released back into the wilds. So these international volunteers are very much brought in under false pretenses. Then when these cubs grow up and they become too boisterous and dangerous for the petting, they often are used for walking interactions with paying tourists. And again, that is, you know, that stage of their lives is also pretty limited, because as soon as they grow up, they do become too dangerous. And that's when they go back to a holding facility for a certain amount of time until they are either right for the captive hunting and or the lion bone industry. And that is where the name bloodlines comes from, because these animals are all bred ultimately to be killed for profit. So they're either killed in the end of the day as a trophy in canned hunts, or they're killed for their bones, claws, teeth, other derivatives, and sold overseas. And the bones are mostly sold to Southeast Asia for traditional medicine purposes. So yeah, that is where the name bloodlines comes from. And basically the whole life cycle of these animals has been commodified. So they try to make as much money off the lions through their whole life. So it is purely for commercial purposes. There's no conservation involved. Yeah.
I want to get into that treatment and then some of the information that you shared with me when we spoke earlier this week in a minute. But if we can pivot real quick and just talk about this landmark decision by the South African government and how big this is. And I see Dr. Peter Cat shaking his head, because just a couple of months ago when I interviewed Dr. Cat, this decision didn't exist. You know, this was the thought, it was a recommendation, but it didn't exist. So it's really a breakthrough that the government is now saying that we need to halt this practice and really rethink how we're treating these lions. How big is this decision?
Oh, it's massive. To be totally honest, so at the end of 2019, I think it was, a high-level panel was put together, and they were mandated to look at the management, the breeding, the handling of several species, and that included lion. So it was 4 iconic species: elephant, leopard, rhino, and lions. And the lions, in particular, they were supposed to be looking at the captive lion breeding. And yeah, I don't think any of us had even dared to dream that it came to such a decision that was so pivotal and so massive. So the report was finalized before Christmas, and we were all waiting and waiting and waiting for the report to be made public. And then on the 2nd of May, Minister Barbara Creasy, the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, she made an announcement online that she was going to adopt the high-level panel recommendations, which are actually majority recommendations, and that captive lions would no longer be bred in South Africa, that we would no longer keep lions in captivity or use captive lions or their derivatives commercially. So that means no sale of the captive lion bone derivatives, and disposal of existing lion bone stockpiles, no hunting of captive bred lions, and no tourism interactions with captive lions, including the so-called voluntourism, as well as co-petting and walking with lions, etc. So yeah, it is a huge decision. Obviously, we're only in the very early stages of this decision. It now needs to be it needs to be implemented. Certain changes in legislation will need to be made. But the fact that it has been recognized, and one of there were several things recognized, but a couple of the very important parts that were recognized were that the lion breeding industry was actually posing a risk to the sustainability of wild lions. So the link between the captive lions and the wild populations was made, that it had a negative impact on South Africa's reputation as a world-class ecotourism destination, as well as a conservation leader. And also that the trade in lion parts could actually be stimulating poaching of lions in the wild, as well as the illegal trades. So some very big links were actually made, that obviously for a long time we've been saying, you know, this is going on, but for the first time it was actually acknowledged. So yeah, it's a massively important decision, very positive. We're very excited is not the right word, but we're so happy that hopefully something will be done. It's going to take a long time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, and it will be a rocky road, but that's fine. It's a very positive start.
Sure. Well, the move is being hailed by conservationists as well as animal welfare advocates who have worked for years, including yourself and some of the others that are probably on this call right now. But it doesn't come without implications, because this really can, as much as we might say, and this report certainly even says that this is potentially has an impact on the sustainability and welfare of lions in captivity. It also has serious implications for tourism, because South Africa, and that's where you are right now, Dr. de Waal, South Africa is known for its safaris. You know, I've visited a safari with my own family, and I think the question that comes up is, what will this really mean? What does this mean for all of the lions that are currently in captivity? We're talking anywhere from 8,000 to as many as 12,000 lions, right, that are in captivity right now.
Yes. Well, that is the problem. I will need to say that, you know, after a year of COVID and lockdown and more or less a hold on tourism, we don't actually know what the numbers are of lions right now. It's never really something that there's been a lot of transparency on. The official numbers have been for the last few years about 8,000 lions. Research shows, in our opinion, we believe that is an underestimation, and we think it's more in the order of 10 to 12,000 lions. But let's not forget all the other big cats in captivity as well in that same system, including cheetahs, leopards, caracals, exotic species like tigers, pumas, jaguars, and even crossbreeds like ligers, so crossbreed between a tiger and a lion. So there's thousands of those animals in captivity as well. But the biggest population has always been lions. And of course, you know, a year long of hardly any tourists, so no income from tourism, from interactions, very few volunteers, very few count hunters. For about 2 years, we have had a 0 lion bone quota. So the income of the lion breeders has been hugely reduced, and what that has, the impact on that on the lions and their welfare. That is going to be massive. But we also hear of mass slaughter as well. So in terms of numbers, we don't actually know where we're sitting. And to come back to your question, what is going to happen to those lions? Well, that is a difficult one to answer because there has been no official announcement what the exact process is going to be. One of the recommendations of the HLP report, high-level panel report, was to look at humane euthanasia. But I think what we need to acknowledge first and foremost is that we need a national audit. We need to know that baseline. We need to know how many facilities there are, how many animals those facilities have in captivity, how many are lions, how many other species, and what is their health, what is their welfare right now. We have a lot of inbred animals in this industry. We have a lot of physically and emotionally abused animals in this industry. So I think that national audit, that baseline audit needs to be done in order for us to know what the next steps are going to be.
You mentioned microchipping, right? Because the other question is, how would you now determine this? What this essentially does is opens now the conversations, being able to even accurately figure out how many lions there are in captivity in South Africa. But once you do, then how do you keep track? I know you mentioned microchipping as a possibility.
Yes, it is a possibility. And in principle, all our captive lions should be microchipped. But we know that that doesn't always happen. Obviously, another thing that will need to be done is we need to stop the breeding. We need to make sure we're not producing any more lions from this point onwards. So there has to be a moratorium on breeding. And we can achieve that in several ways. We can go for sterilization, we can use contraceptives, we can also make sure that males and females are separated. So I think that is also something that has to come first and foremost. We have to stop the breeding. And then I think microchipping has to be the way forward, so we can track and trace these animals. And then proper professionals, veterinarians who know what they're doing, they need to make an inventory of those animals that are well enough to maybe be saved, and those animals that will need to be humanely euthanized. But only at that point, when we know what's the animals, the numbers, and their health situation, there is not really much we can do. We can only really sort of we can come up with assumptions and ideas at the moment, but how that is going to be dealt with, we don't really know yet. But we do know, although it's going to be a massively difficult situation and hugely emotional as well, to be saying, oh, we need to euthanize a lot of these animals. But because it's a difficult decision doesn't mean we have to continue in a do nothing scenario, because then it will only get worse. The numbers will only grow. So we have to, you know, this is the most difficult point where now the beginning of ending this industry is here, then some very tough decisions need to be made.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, I want to just take a minute to just acknowledge those who are just joining us on this MojoStreaming Live interview today with Dr. Louise. We're talking about blood lions And as you may have heard, the South African government has made a critical decision to ban captive lion facilities in South Africa and to halt the commercial use of captive lions and their derivatives. Dr. de Waal has been a leader in this discussion and in this battle, I think it's fair to say. And so today we wanted to talk about kind of what this decision actually means, what it means for tourism, what does it actually mean for the wildlife industry in South Africa and really globally, because this is not just an issue that is unique to South Africa, as Dr. de Waal has pointed out in a lot of her research, that this is an issue that is going to need to be addressed in other areas here in the United States. I'm in New York, and you know, there's breeding here as well of wildlife. So it's not just an issue that is unique to South Africa. But Dr. de Waal, why should people really care? Why does it matter to the average person that these lions are being bred and used? You know, basically they're being bred just to be killed.
Mm. Obviously, that is part of the underlying problem, is what is the important issue for the different people. And I think if we look at South Africa as a whole, we are commodifying an iconic species, an iconic African species that is so important from a tourism point of view as well. But the way we are treating those species is hugely unethical as well. And the welfare issues involved in that captive industry are absolutely appalling. And then, of course, as I was saying early on, some of the reasons that were recognized by the high-level panel in their report, including the potential impact of this industry on the wild lion population that is already under threat. The reputational damage this industry is doing on our hugely important tourism industry, the potential for poaching of wild lions and illegal wildlife trade. There's been direct links between the breeding and lion bone industry and some of the big wildlife syndicates in Vietnam. So there's so many reasons why people should care. And a lot of these wildlife criminal syndicates, they don't just deal in wildlife, they deal in drugs, and they very often deal in human trafficking as well.
And that's something that we got into in our interview with Dr. Peter Patton, who's also joining us today. What is trophy lions? What does that mean?
Well, the trophy hunting of captive bred lions is what hunters would describe as a form of trophy hunting where there is no fair chase. Because basically what happens is you use a lion that has been habituated to people, that has always been reliant on their food, their shelter, the whole care from the moment they were born until that moment that they're being shot. They've been reliant on human beings. Very often they are fed from a vehicle. So they even associate vehicles with food. They associate people with food. They're so habituated, they've lost their fear for humans. Then those animals are being released in very small fenced areas where there's no escape for them. A vehicle with a hunter on the back is then put in that same area and they're being shot. So, and the time between the release and the actual hunt itself can be as short as 96 hours. And that's official. Unofficially, it even happens that the lions are still slightly groggy from their sedative. They're being released and shot. So again, it's an incredibly unethical.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment just to remind everyone who's joining us that the movie Blood Lions, which you can see on MojoStreaming, really highlights this issue and shows you just how cruel this treatment really is. And I do feel a little opinionated about it, because to see it just breaks your heart, to think that these, again, as you said, Dr. DeWall, these are animals that were bred, that we've befriended, we've raised, we've used them for our own family enjoyment, and then we set them free and cruelly slaughter them, and it's horrible. So it's terrible. I want to ask everyone, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat. Just a few minutes, I'm going to actually open up the floor to see if anyone would like to ask Dr. DeWall any questions. Before we get to that, though, I did want to also talk about the fact that when I asked you why we could not just release these lions, because when you talk about mass euthanization, that feels cruel as well. However, you explained to me that a lot of these lions are actually not well. They've been inbred, so they sometimes have physical or maybe even mental or emotional issues that makes them not necessarily well enough. And with there being, they're very expensive to care for. So if we were to just release them into the wild, that they would not be able to survive more than likely on their own. There's not enough sanctuaries in South Africa in order to be able to release them and have them raised kind of in a semi-controlled wild environment. And so can you talk a little bit about the condition of these lions?
Sure. Yeah, and I think the inbreeding is a very important issue. This whole industry has always had issues with inbreeding, because the original stock was a fairly small amount of stock. They're not really interested in particularly strong genetics. So it's very common that fathers and daughters reproduce, and that goes on for generations, especially when selective breeding happens for example, white lions. The white lion population in the wild has always been very small, so the number of again, the stock animals that were used for breeding was probably as small as maybe 2, 3, 4 animals. So inbreeding is huge. We cannot afford to release compromised genes into strong wild populations. So that is one of the elements why rewilding of captive bred lions is an issue. They also are physically inferior. They have never hunted for themselves. They don't understand. They've never lived in social structures, in a pride. Very often when you go to these captive facilities, you see age groups, very young animals, a few months old, a year old, and they're sort of all together, same ages together in a normal wild pride. That is a mixture, and there is a social structure in there. These animals have never lived that way. They're human habituated. So again, in terms of local communities that live close to protected areas, that can be creating huge problems with human wildlife conflicts, because they don't have that fear, that natural fear for people. So yeah, there's just so many reasons why we can't. And on top of that, we just don't have that amount of safe habitats. To just give you an idea, we've got about 3,000 lions in the wilds in South Africa, including those lions in managed reserves. So that includes the sort of what is referred to as the wild population and the wild managed population, more or less 3,000.
Population is then 3 to 4 times the amount of
exactly.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. 3 to 4 times more lions in captivity than in the wilds. So we don't have that space. And in the end of the day, the problems for wild lions is not a problem with reproduction. The problem is lack of safe habitats, and human-wildlife conflicts, lack of prey species. Those are the issues, not so much reproduction. If we give our lions safe habitats, and I'm sure Dr. Kat will sort of acknowledge that as well, they are very capable of reproducing. So yeah, there's lots of issues why we can't actually release those animals into the wild, which is extremely sad, obviously. And for sanctuaries, if we want lions, captive bred lions, to be cared for in a proper sanctuary, which means a facility that doesn't breed, it doesn't trade, it doesn't allow interaction, and it will actually provide a forever home until the end of its natural life. That is a huge financial responsibility.
Right.
A lot of these animals in captivity, they can live up to 15, sometimes 20 years. So to look after that number, say the 8,000, say by now we have 8,000 lions left, that's still a massive financial responsibility year on year on year. And just to give everybody a feel, we believe about a handful, about 5, 6 maybe, proper true sanctuaries in South Africa. The biggest one looks after just over 100 big cats. And that is a massive responsibility. So we would need 8,000 divided by 100. We would need another 80 of those sanctuaries, 80, to look after all those lions.
Right. Wow, that's really something. I do want to open it up, Dr. Duvall, to some of the questions. There's several questions in the chat here. Sally Davis asked, what can we do to assist in our everyday life to help with this initiative?
I think one of the things that people can do is never interact with captive wildlife, wherever that is, because that, from a welfare point of view, is never a good thing. When people want to volunteer, make sure they're asking the right questions, and keep it wild. When you go on holiday, go and visit those animals in their wild and natural habitats. Support those, because the tourism in those places support the conservation of those species in the wilds. So I think that is one of the most important things people can do.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but how would the average person know the difference? If you're touring, you're visiting, and you are signing up for a wildlife excursion, how do you know the difference of whether it's captive lions versus lions in their natural habitat?
It's actually quite easy, because if you are in a proper, even if it's a smaller private fenced reserve, all the animals have a natural behavior. They look after themselves, they feed themselves, they hunt for themselves. There might be small management interactions, but those animals are in a large space. There's no human interaction, no human interference. Whereas when you see a camp or an enclosure that is small with fences, where the lions straight away come up to the fence to say hello, that's already a red flag, because those lions are used to people. Normally, that is not a behavior that animals have. If a facility always has cubs, young lions available, red flag. You need to start thinking and asking questions. Where do these cubs come from? And where do they go to? Where are their mothers? Why are these cubs not with their mothers? Why are they here interacting with tourists? There's so many. Just stop, and you will actually understand what I'm saying, because it's not rocket science. It's actually quite simple. Think about, why is a cup here and not with its mother? That is one question already. And if a facility has always got cups, these cups can only be used maybe for 4 months and then they move on. So there is a continuous cycle. So every 3 to 4 times a year, they will have to get new cups. So where are all those cups going to? Where are all the adults? Show me, where are the adults? Where are they going to? So there's some very simple questions people can ask.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a large responsibility that everyone actually has in making sure that this really money is the key. As long as the industry is making money, then it's going to continue. So if we want to really do something, we have to stop opening our pocketbooks and supporting this. And that it sounds like that. I want to open it up and ask if anyone in our audience would like to come on and ask a question. Of course, Dr. Peter Cat. Oh, we can't hear you, Dr. Peter.
I know. I'm just pressing the unmute. Louise, thank you. That was an absolutely wonderful interview that you had. Now, I've got a number of questions to you. I don't know whether you can answer them, but anyway, I'll
if I can't, I will say so.
All right. But I sort of believe that what happened with Barbara Creasy and this high-level panel is that they sort of came out of left field. She didn't anticipate this this decision, and I wonder whether, you know, you said earlier during the interview that she adopted the high-level panel conclusions. But my first question is this an obligation for her to do something or just a suggestion?
No, it's so in particular with regards to the captive lions, there were majority and minority recommendations, and she decided to go with majority recommendations. At the moment, as we speak, we're actually waiting for a policy document to be released that is based on these high-level panel recommendations. That policy document then goes to public participation. The public will have 30 days, I believe, to comment on that. And from that point onwards, then there will be various things that will need to happen, amongst others, some changes to existing legislation, and they will have to start looking at the implementation of these recommendations. So that policy document is incredibly important because that will lay the basis for future changes to legislation and also to the development of a white paper.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. But you know, what is written in the South African Constitution is that there is a constitutional right of use of natural resources while promoting economic development. Okay, so that's one problem that you know these.
Well, it isn't really a problem because I'm not an expert in constitutional law, but I know that there is experts in constitutional law that do believe, and which is also supported by some of the constitutional court rulings, that the interpretation of that section 24 in our Bill of Rights is actually not correct, because that section 24 actually talks about ecologically sustainable utilization, and that is something that is being looked at as well. And the high-level panel report is very clear that interpretation and the definition of sustainable, ecologically sustainable utilization needs to be modified and looked at. So that is something that needs to be addressed as well. And that is used as an excuse for many years to continue this industry. You're absolutely right, but it's just a particular interpretation of that Section 24, which is now being disputed by experts as well.
Yeah, and but the other thing, Louise, is that these lions are now considered privately owned. And you know, there was that thing where they were declared no more than livestock in terms of the law. So how do they get around that? Because you know, you can't tell somebody that you can't own a cow anymore or breed from a cow anymore. So there needs to be some big changes in sort of the interpretation that the South African government has given these wild animals.
Yeah, and that is where the amendments to existing legislation come into effect as well. But obviously, in the interim, as I understand it, I think it is in the minister's right and her power to put moratoriums on certain parts of the trade until such legislation changes and amendments have been made. So in the interim, the minister could put a moratorium on the breeding. Already we have not had a annual export quota on lion bones. That quota can remain 0 for the time being, which means that legally lion skeletons cannot be exported from South Africa. So there is a lot in her power that she can do in the interim until legislation has been amended, because obviously to amend legislation is not something you can just do and cross out. That also needs to go through the proper procedures and processes, and needs to go through public participation. So yeah, that's why I was saying early on, it's going to be quite a long and bumpy road, but it's not one that is inconceivable. I think all the issues that you have pointed out, there are solutions for, even though those solutions may not be easy, but we have to go through. We have to follow this through now, because a do nothing scenario is no longer an option. Because we've seen what happens. We've done that now for decades, where we had a do nothing, let the status quo continue, and we've seen that population of captive bred lions and other big cats grow and grow. We've seen the number of facilities growing. We've seen the welfare issues associated with that industry grow as well. So do nothing is no longer an option.
And if I could jump in for a second, I think it's safe to say that this is really just a start. It's at least a start in the right direction of getting this conversation started. It's a step in the right direction. And Dr. Peter Catt, I think what you're pointing out is a study that they have been doing over the past several years found that I think the NSPCA Wildlife Protection Unit inspected 95 lion breeding and holding facilities and found dozens of them that were keeping these lions in inadequate enclosures without proper hygiene, without food, enrichment activities, or even veterinarian care. So, you know, these lions are suffering, and that's why this is so tragic here. And my question to you is COVID. How has COVID impacted? Because this industry survives largely on tourism. And if tourism has been halted, and I know that that South Africa right now is experiencing a new wave of COVID spread, then does that mean that these lions are even being forgotten more than they were before? If we're seeing back in 2016, 2017, they were suffering, and now tourism has kind of come to a bit of a halt, then how are they being cared for right now?
It's a very good question, and to be quite honest, I think the welfare issues have only deteriorated as a result of the COVID, as you say. COVID meant no tourism, so no interactions, no paying volunteers, virtually no hunters. As I was saying, we haven't had a legal lion bone export quota. So the income for those facilities has shrunk, has just virtually gone down to zero. So yeah, it doesn't bode well for the welfare. We are getting some reports of welfare issues, but also of mass slaughter of animals, because it's too expensive to keep those animals, to feed them. One little positive is that I've also heard that some of the breeders have stopped breeding because they cannot afford to look after more animals. So at least that is a slight little positive. But yeah, COVID obviously has brought this industry to its knees, which is never a good thing in terms of, if you want to phase out an industry, it has to be done properly. And obviously COVID just came unexpected out of the blue, and it's lasted for this long, and it's going to last much longer. I was saying earlier that, you know, our vaccination program has only just started. Our third wave has absolutely taken off, in especially in Gauteng. So yeah, this is going to carry on for a lot longer. So to have this kind of impact on an industry without a planned phase out is never good for the welfare of the animals involved.
Right. I want to.
Sorry, Kathleen, sorry.
Yes. Yes.
We have some questions at the chat. If you don't mind me,
Yep.
I
I'm
will
going
read
to.
it.
I am
You're
going
going
to.
to read it?
Right. Yep. I'll read them.
Go ahead.
I just want to, before I even get into that, just thank anyone again for who might have joined us late, with Dr. Louise talking about blood lions and this landmark decision by the South African government to halt or ban the captivity of lions, or any new captivity. Please send questions, and we have about 10 more minutes with Louise. So if you'd like to share your camera and ask a question, raise your hand. There's a couple of more. Oh, before we even go into this, I want to remind you also, on MojoStreaming for a limited time, you can watch the award-winning film Blood Lions to learn more and really see why this is such a big issue. If you want to see what's happening to these lions, watch this film. It's really heartbreaking. It really is, and it should be a concern, a human cry, and concern to end this. I did want to say there's one question. It says, do you anticipate expanding projects from other countries in Africa? How invest in wildlife and have lions, or I'm sorry, let me read. My question is to you, do you expect to expand your projects from other countries in Africa? How invest in wildlife and have lions, or do more research from different countries? I guess what they're asking is, do you anticipate expanding this research into other countries? You mentioned the Chinese, that we can learn a lot from working with some of the other countries who also have experience in this.
Yeah, we do. Obviously, we also have partners. We work with World Animal Protection, who do quite a lot of work in Southeast Asia. I think demand reduction is an important one that we need to look at, because there is a market for lion bones, for example. There is a huge market for all sorts of wildlife products. So demand reduction is something that needs to be worked on, but obviously we're in the wrong geographical area. That's why we work with partners on those kind of issues. Same with conservation of wild lions. That obviously needs a continued input, and especially how is the closure of big captive lion breeding industry in South Africa, how is that going to impact on the wild lion population? And I think that is something that we're looking at to hopefully partner with people who are doing that kind of conservation research on the ground. Panthera has already done some research on the poaching of lions for their body parts. And I think a lot more of that kind of research, because the more we understand how it all works, how all these parts are actually connected, um, it becomes easier. The more we understand it, the more we know, the easier it is to come up with solutions. And that is what we need to do in the long term. We need to come up with solutions.
I would like to ask Louise, is there anyone on this call who might be on the other side, that has a question or anything from the other point of view? One of the questions that Bernard, our founder of MojoStreaming, brought up is, do you expect cooperation from lion breeders and others that are invested in wildlife farming?
Well, that is something to be seen. I think at the moment they're still very much opposed, and they will be fighting this. We know they will when they get a chance. They've done this in the past when another Minister of Environment tried to make changes to the release time of between lions in captivity and the situation of the canned hunting, so the release time between the two, that the minister in 2007 wanted to make that release time into 24 months. So it was like a proper rewilding. That decision was contested in court by the industry, and they actually won that. So that's another reason why the government will need to make sure that they've crossed their T's and dotted all their I's, that there are no procedural loopholes that can be contested in court. I think some of the, maybe especially the facilities that are more on the tourism operational side, I think they will see the advantage of cooperating and hopefully changing their business model, because I think there's quite a lot of facilities that can continue their business by changing their business model into something that is more sustainable and more responsible. So I think some of those businesses, I hope they will be interested to cooperate and work with other partners, because, for example, our tourism association, they brought out guidelines on the interaction with captive wildlife, and they recognized basically the same as what the HLP report has recognized, that we should no longer interact with wildlife in captivity, whether those are cubs or adult lions or cheetahs or tigers, or whether those are elephants for elephant riding, or that doesn't fit in our modern tourism space anymore. So we know that there will be cooperation, there will be help if people want to from that side as well. There are plenty of people with expertise, with willingness and passion to guide people to change.
That's going to be that's a big question of the day, is how do you change people's, their livelihood? Some people are making, their entire life is being supported by this practice. And then two, tourism, we're curious as human beings, we want to get right in there and see how the wild is living, but I think there's a responsible way to do it. I do want to clarify that the Bloodlines film can be seen on your site, bloodlions.com. However, we do have a link on MojoStreaming, and that link is also in our chat here. So if you want to watch that film, So one more question, are there any plans in place on how to deal with the huge public outcry that can be expected from the euthanasia issue? I mean, that sounds almost, just as, it's just as sad as the practice is when you really think about it.
Yeah, it is incredibly sad. But to be honest, for people who have been to some of these facilities and seen the state that these animals actually live in, the physical and the emotional abuse that they've experienced all their lives, I think then people will start to realize that for quite a number of those animals, it might be the most humane thing to do is to actually euthanize them. Because these animals, these are wild animals. They're not domesticated. They are at best habituated, but they're not domesticated. They need space. They have their wild instincts. What we do to them by trying to domesticate them in a captive situation is just a far cry from what the way they should be living and the majestic animals they are in the natural world. And I've seen welfare conditions that literally bring you down on your knees in floods of tears because it's just so horrific. And for some of those animals, it is the kindest thing we can do for them. Do not think for a moment that most of these animals are in proper, beautiful, pristine physical and emotional conditions, because they're not. And that is the sad truth of this industry and what we have created. And yes, it's going to be horrendous. And yes, the wildlife and the welfare space, the advocacy space, they will get the blame in many ways, because we're the ones who were driving to for change. But in the end of the day, we weren't the ones who started this industry. We have never been the ones who financially benefited from this industry, and we've not been the ones that have enabled this industry to grow. But we are here, and we've been saying this over and over to the minister and the department. We are here, and where we can, we will help. There is a huge amount of expertise and experience in our sector, in lots of different fields, that can be incredibly useful in a phase out of an industry of this size. Because as we've seen from COVID, you cannot stop an industry like this overnight. You have to do it in a well-planned and responsible manner, so the welfare of the animals involved is not going to suffer.
Right. Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Louise Duval, for taking the time and being so generous with your time today, all the way from South Africa. I know it's getting a little late there, so I want to be mindful of the time that you spent with us. If you have not already done so, I also want to remind all of you joining us today to please sign up at MojoStreaming.com to keep abreast of the exciting wildlife topics that we have lined up in the coming weeks and months. I want to thank everyone else who took the time out to join us today on this very important topic, and also remind you again that you can find out more information about Blood Lions and the work that Dr. Louise Duval is doing at bloodlions.org, as well as to see the film, which again is if you're on the fence about why this should be a topic that we all should care about, then take the time to watch this film. It will be available for a limited time. You can always communicate with us as well. Leave us your comments, check back in. We are a up and coming new site, and we are passionate about the issues that affect wildlife globally, and we'd love to hear your comments. We'd love you to join and be a part of what we're building here as a community. So thank you again. Are there any final thoughts, Dr. Duval, before we end?
Oh yeah, I just hope that these bold decisions by the minister will, yeah, that we will manage to follow them through, because to actually be able to set such a massive precedent, an example to the world, that we can change, that we can actually turn a situation that we've allowed to develop around for the positive, for the better, I think would be such an enormously strong message that we can send to the world. Because as you were saying right at the start, there's so much captive breeding going on. In the States, I believe there's more tigers in captivity in the States than there are in the wilds. So yes, the industry as it exists in South Africa is pretty unique in many ways, but in other ways it's not. And to set an example that we can actually change, that we can turn things around would be incredible. So yeah, watch this space, because it's going to be an interesting and very exciting road to journey really, to follow, and so yeah, that is probably the only thing I would like to say. And thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you very much, MojoStreaming, for having us and to bring attention to these topics, because awareness is key. We cannot do the work, we cannot enable change unless people understand why. If the people out there don't understand why we're so strongly opposed to this industry, we were not going to get the support, and we need the support from the public as much as anything else. So yeah, to have a platform like yours that enables that raising of awareness and educating the public is amazing. So thank you very much.
You are so welcome. All right, well, with that, I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. Change can only come when we all do our part. So let's hope
Exactly.
that this will not just be talk, but there will be some actual action that comes as a result of this report. And we will certainly do our part to continue to follow this issue. And if there are any new developments, you can count on us to bring it to your attention immediately. All right, everybody have a beautiful day. Thank you again. Make sure you follow us at mojostreaming.com, sign up, and be a part of the change. Have a great day, everyone.